好，接下来我们即将邀请到的是 Animoca Brands 联合创始人兼执行董事长 Yat Siu，他将为我们带来主旨演讲，从开源到开放资产，为什么 NFT 将会提供真正的数字产权？他将通过线上连线的方式为我们带来演讲。
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Yat. I'm the chairman of Animoca Brands and its co-founder. And today I'm going to talk to you about the evolution of open assets and why non-fungible tokens matter, particularly in the face of the open metaverse that we're also intent on building. So very quickly, I will just quickly introduce Animoca Brands briefly for those of you who are not too familiar with who we are. We're a company that is quite international. Originally founded in Hong Kong, a company that is focused on building, basically delivering digital property rights. Originally starting with gamers, because we think gamers are the community that understands ownership of virtual assets more than others, just because when they buy assets inside games, they think of it as one of ownership, even though it's one of rental today. The way we got started with non-fungible tokens was really way back in 2017, so quite some time ago, originally with CryptoKitties. And since then, we have made over 100 investments in the NFT space, including Sky Mavis, which is the creators of Axie Infinity, OpenSea, Dapper Labs, Bitski, Wax, and a whole bunch of other businesses. But we are also major shareholders and owners of products such as the Sandbox, which Sebastian had just most recently introduced, and also F1 Delta Time, Rev Racing, Gamey, Quid, and a whole bunch of other metaverses that we're building. And what we care about really is about building the open metaverse, and which I'll explain shortly. So let me first start with this topic, which maybe was covered a little bit, but I think it's worth talking about, which is basically ownership of the world's most valuable resource. And the world's most valuable resource today is no longer things that grow from the ground or that you can get because you have ownership in land. It is actually stuff that is coming from our mind. In other words, it is data. Data is the world's most valuable resource. And we can already see that today when we compare what are the most powerful companies today, versus 20 years ago. 20 years ago, they were mostly energy companies, and today they're all data companies. Whether this is Facebook or Google or Tencent, these are the most valuable companies because of data. The other thing to understand about data is that data has gravity. And what that means is that when data is mixed together, it actually becomes heavier. It becomes more powerful and more influential. And actually, as a result, attracts more influence. So data and more data begets more influence. And we see this happening already, when people use online services, actually that data platform grows significantly in time. But the thing about this data gravity that is formed is it actually comes entirely from one of the scarcest resources on Earth, which is our time. And the reason we define this as a scarce resource, and sometimes people describe non-fungible tokens as scarce assets, is we think of it as scarce assets because it is our time, our effort, and we have a limited time on Earth, meaning each and every one of us might only live for maybe, if we're lucky, 100, 120 years, right? And that time is precious because we all have an end to that time. And that is a form of data. Each time we contribute, whether we choose to spend it with family, whether we choose to work, whether we choose to start a business, all the stuff is a decision we make relative to our time. That time is data. That data is information. That information becomes knowledge when mixed together with other forms of data. The problem is that that data doesn't belong to us. And the problem is that essentially what's happening today is that this data gravity that I described before, that knowledge, that network effect is growing away from the people who actually delivered that data. Put another way, what is in fact a platform like Facebook or Instagram or even Tencent without its users? It is actually not very interesting. So for the time that we spend inside all of these platforms, we enrich the platform every single day, yet we get nothing in return for it. And that's partially because they can harvest that network effect and live in a kind of what we describe digital feudalism, right? Where essentially you have multiple, you can think of it as little kingdoms, whether it's a kingdom of Tencent or kingdom of Apple or kingdom of Google. Each of these have their own specific sort of data walls, data walled gardens, where they don't share information with each other and try to retain customers and users within that system to control the network effect. But again, we don't own anything in this. And every single day as we spend on these platforms, we make these platforms richer and more powerful at our expense because we are giving up our time. And so this is where this interesting innovation that came about through blockchain, which is these non-fungible tokens, has come about. And I want to describe exactly how we view non-fungible tokens and why this is such an incredible opportunity to redraw data ownership in the world. Open digital assets, as in true NFTs, essentially represent your data rights. And what they allow you to do is, because it's a data that you now own and is not owned by any platform, because it's on the blockchain, essentially allows for open composability on top of it. It means that I can create experiences on top of experiences. Victor had just previously described, remixing of non-fungible tokens to create new experiences is one such example in which you can essentially layer new experiences on top of that. And that creates gravity and creates impact and influence because other people are building on top of these digital assets. And we see this already in the past with Web 1, Web 2. One of the few constructs that survive this is basically open source because it starts with code. And code is, in fact, one of those incredibly composable items. You get a piece of code that someone has written, and then someone else starts to write another piece of code on top of it, to add on top of it, and on top of it, and on top of it. And when hundreds of people start contributing towards this code, it becomes a new kind of code that may have nothing to do with the original one, but started with that original seed of an idea that essentially mushroomed through human ingenuity, through our time, through our creativity. The other thing, though, that made open source so powerful is the fact that open source actually was borderless because it had one language. Now, don't worry about the language here. It's just gibberish, of course, but it's an illustration because unlike the written word, code is all written in generally the same syntax. What it means, therefore, is that we can share code across the world because we understand it. But just imagine what the world would have looked like if code was in fact divided across national borders like we have with languages. It would be difficult for people to sort of share information because we don't have a cross-language interface. But code was generally the same language for the most part. And it allowed the way of cross-application interoperability, you could say, through the mixing and remixing of code, meaning that a developer in Russia, in the US, in Germany, in China, in Australia, we can all share together. We can take that code, we can work on it together, and we can create an interesting result out of this, maybe one that was unintended. And today, open source is the most powerful Web 2 construct because it is the reason that has created companies like Huawei or Lenovo or even Google or pretty much every company. And in fact, when you think about the entire blockchain industry, really its formation was made possible because of open source. But it is also the reason why small companies that are only 5 or 10 person in size can compete with an organization like Google or Tencent or one of the biggest companies in the world because they have access to the world's knowledge. That is basically something that is unbeatable because the network effect, the data gravity of code, of open source code, is always greater than closed source code, meaning that code has therefore become open and openly composable for everyone to partake. And what we've seen here, of course, is that the innovation scale has grown because as more code is delivered, there's more, of course, because it's open, essentially, there's more sharing that happens. And as there's more sharing of code and more sharing of ideas, the ability to generate new ideas and new innovations increases. Every time more people share, more ideas are generated and the innovation space accelerates, which is what we've basically seen really ever since the advent of the internet and open source code. But there is one problem. The problem is that code requires you to know how to read code. And the problem is code is very complicated for most people. The vast majority of the world still does not understand code. Even though we try to teach our children to read code, most of them don't want to be coders at the end of the day, right? It's a different language. It's kind of difficult, right? And it's complicated. And that means, as a result, we have created an inadvertent elite, the new digital elite, the people who could read code, who could understand it, and they could take advantage of this new sort of open composability that only people who are engineers and coders could do. This is what's interesting around non-fungible tokens, because it allows the same kind of composability as open source did in the form of code, except now you can do it without knowing any code. You can be an artist and compose on top. You can be a photographer. You can be a musician. You can be a gamer. You can be anything that you want to be and have a construct where you own your data and can have the same network effect and the same benefits, but one that is around culture and not one that is around knowing a specific skill set, which in this case is a language, the language of code. And non-fungible tokens represents this. And of course, we're in a blockchain conference, so I don't have to explain the reasons this works, but it is important to understand that because a true NFT is on an open blockchain, one that is owned by its users, it means it is therefore also truly yours, and the only way that the ownership can ever be contested is if the consensus disagrees, which basically means that for the most part, it's almost guaranteed that the asset ownership is therefore yours. Whereas in the world of the platforms, of the Web2 companies, that data is stored inside a server that belongs to a company, say like Facebook, and that company, you operate under their terms of service, right? And now imagine what happens if a company like Facebook or Apple says, we don't like you, or for whatever reason, we have to remove you. Actually, what happens to your own human potential? It is significantly reduced because of the fact that actually you can no longer maybe make friends the same way. You can't conduct business the same way. So in effect, we're being digitally deplatformed is actually perhaps one of the worst things that can happen to us because our human potential is significantly reduced. But who owns that and who controls that? And that's why blockchain is so interesting, because the ownership is now one that is away from the platform and belongs to the end users. Non-fungible tokens are stores of culture. And the reason it becomes so accessible is because we all interact with culture far, far more than we interact with money. Of course, money is important. It greases the economy. It makes things work. We can pay for our food and for our living. But we interact with culture much more. They are our traditions. They are our relationships. It's the things that we feel. Most of us may like money, but we don't necessarily love money. But we love culture. We love our fans. We love our family, all that kind of stuff. We love art, right? People don't buy art, or people don't collect things because they want to make money right away. For the most part, most of us want to collect historic moments, culture, like a wedding ring. A wedding ring is not intrinsically valuable in and of itself, but it has so much culture and tradition. And that becomes something that stores a history or memory that is meaningful to you. And that is what non-fungible tokens can do now in the digital world. And given the fact that we spend so much time in the digital world, this is that medium in which we translate that emotion, that feeling, that value. And so non-fungible tokens represent that culture. And as I explained earlier, now you can have these layers on top. And data gravity is developed much like open source, except now it's layered experiences on top of these digital assets. Meaning that I could have one asset that could begin with maybe a game, but afterwards that game could have another story, or it could be used in a DeFi way, or it could be used in other ways that I have no control over whatsoever, because you basically have simply human imagination and creativity being the limit of its interaction. Because now I can have a relationship with the asset simply because you own it, not needing permission from the platform. In the physical world, this happens all the time already. When you buy a car, right, that is one example of how you interact with the automotive industry. But when you consider the entire ecosystem around cars in the physical context, that is permissionless, whether it's the hiring of drivers, the construction of roads, the fuel economies, the mechanics, the accessorization of cars, it is far, far greater than the sale of the car in and of itself. And more importantly, the external ecosystem that companies like Tesla or Volkswagen have no direct influence in, inform the value and the desirability of the car as well. For instance, would you buy an electric car if there was no charging station? Or would you buy a certain kind of car if there was only one mechanic in town? And the answer is, of course, you make these decisions based on social signals as well as on practical utility signals. One of the examples I like to give is the baby seat, because that is an innovation that most certainly did not happen with the permission of a car company. When cars were first created, they did not say, let's make some baby seats, right? These baby seats were the invention of a group of people who said, we need to have safety for our children or practicality for our children. And this was in 1933 when the first baby seat came about. Obviously, they looked very ugly and they were impractical, but they served a purpose. And then they started to become a business. And now every parent buys baby seats for their cars, right? And that's an example of composability, of people adding on top of an existing asset and building. And so I think this is how we can imagine how open digital assets will interact, not in a physical sense, but in a metaphysical sense, in a virtual way, where we can start building experiences simply limited by our needs and by imagination as to what we want to build on top. In the future, non-fungible tokens are going to be represented through multiple assets throughout all, meaning that if I have a virtual sword, it could be used in one game, it could be used in 10 games. And in fact, the virtual assets that have the most utility, or perhaps the most use cases throughout the metaverse, which may be in many metaverses. It could be in the sandbox, it could be in another game, it could be, in gaming, it could be in all sorts of different platforms. Those assets that have more utility will have more value and more desirability as a result. And this is a change in the way when you think about the business model of a traditional game company, where really the game assets themselves traditionally only existed to support the game in and of itself. So the assets themselves were considered worthless because they have to support the game. But with non-fungible tokens in the metaverse, with these open digital assets, NFTs become the center of the experience. It means that because I own this asset, things will come to me. Because I own assets, people will deliver services that are valuable to me. And this is something that already is happening, when you talk about lending of NFTs. This is already happening when people give utility in other ways, or I can mix or integrate. And of course, the benefit for a game studio to take assets that are potentially valuable is because I can now bring those customers into my game instead of having to go to the app store to basically be discovered. If you think about what's happening today, Steam is banning blockchain games or has banned blockchain games. Apple isn't sure, right? And yet, in the world of non-fungible tokens, we don't need any of that because simply ownership is enough to be sort of growing from the community because assets become the center of that experience. There's some great examples. If you haven't seen them yet, Loot is perhaps a very good one. Well, of course, Sandbox or Bored Apes, but I'll focus a little bit on Loot because Loot is basically just a sort of list of words that are reminiscent of the time, randomly generated words, during the time of Dungeons and Dragons. And so anyone who grew with D&D and with sort of these type of fantasy stories, they understood this and it captured their imagination. And now multiple companies around the world are building applications simply on top of these words, right? Like building new stories out of an existing randomly generated story. And it didn't require a lot of value in a traditional sense. It required simply your imagination and your emotion to basically do that. But other forms of remixing already happen today. Like if you look at what happened in the Sandbox, with Snoop Dogg coming in, he's launching a party, he's putting his image in there, he's remixing his culture together with the culture of the Sandbox and bringing people together as well, meshing virtual identities. And of course, because it's non-fungible tokens, you are in a position to actually share and own a piece of the metaverse. And that is now truly yours because it's secured through the blockchain. So I want to address essentially sort of some of the aspects around value here as well, because we've seen a lot of news around why non-fungible tokens might be valuable, and isn't it a little bit crazy, and why should we care? And I think the important thing to understand here is that non-fungible tokens, because they represent property rights, if they become meaningful property rights, then as a community we care that this property is ours, and therefore we care that they exist in an open manner rather than taking it into closed manner. But let's talk a little bit about value, because perhaps one of the best examples I can give is this. A Birkin bag is roughly the same value as a Bored Ape. And one can certainly argue that I can touch and feel a Birkin bag versus a Bored Ape. I can't really touch it per se. But when you think about the context of value, why do I own this? In fact, is the material worth the price you just paid for that Birkin bag? And the answer is, of course, no. What you're actually buying in a Birkin bag is 99.9% entirely virtual. You're buying the story, you're buying the legacy, you're buying the creation, you're buying the imagination. That's what you're buying. And when you're buying a Bored Ape for that community, it's exactly the same, except perhaps it doesn't have the physical context, but you're buying the story, you're buying the community. When you buy a car, for instance, maybe it's an expensive car, you're actually saying something about yourself. It is more than just a social identifier. It is something that means to you. If we decide to, be environmentally friendly, and buy products that are sort of organic, we're saying something about who we are, and we're willing to pay something for that because of the story that it represents, because it gives us meaning and purpose. So value, I would argue, is already very virtual to begin with. And in fact, even in the physical world, is very virtual in context. It's simply transplanted more naturally into the virtual world. And because think about our children, for instance, what they want, maybe for Christmas, typically speaking, it will be something that is virtual. Because already, this year, over $100 billion worth of virtual goods is being spent, basically on these gaming assets that people believe they own, but in reality, they don't own any of it. In fact, they're renting. So we have a $100 billion rental economy that is waiting to go into the ownership economy, which is why we see the increase of value, just like we see from a physical world. When you go from rental to ownership, there's an increase in value. So in closing, let me address this topic that comes up a lot. What is the metaverse? How does it matter? And how does digital property rights fit into all of this? So first of all, I would argue that, with 2.7 billion gamers already playing a lot of time, if you think about the time we all spend basically on the internet, arguably we are perhaps already living in a kind of quasi-metaverse today, right? And certainly the Web2 giants, companies such as Facebook, are already saying they're going to turn themselves into a metaverse company. And in fact, they're saying that they're hiring 10,000 people in Europe alone to build the metaverse, as it were. To me, this is not, however, about ownership. And to me, what Facebook is building, in my view, is a fake metaverse. In fact, everyone who is not building an open metaverse where you can have true ownership, in our view, is a fake metaverse. And by fake metaverse, I mean it's Disneyland. Disneyland is a beautiful place. We can have a lot of fun in Disneyland. We can hang out there and enjoy it. But do we actually want to live there? Do we want to live in the rules of Disneyland? Do we want to actually be controlled by that circumstance? And the answer is, of course, not. So we can be there for fun, but we're not going to want to live there, right? And platforms like Facebook are trying to allure us to move into an environment where we actually are sort of living in this quasi-happy land. But in reality, what's happening is they're taking our data and they're taking control of our lives. This is not what the metaverse should look like. So we should absolutely stay as open as we can and not be in an environment where essentially we are controlled by one entity. The metaverse, in our view, is not one company or one product. It is thousands of products or tens of thousands. It's every person that essentially has data ownership in there. So in closing, briefly talking about how open source changed the world, I want to talk about a different kind of open source. And this is perhaps one of the more optimistic views of the world, but I talk about the mashing of cultures. The fortune cookie is a very interesting thing because it's not Chinese at all. But yet everyone in the West thinks of fortune cookies as a Chinese dish. But nobody in China, as you all know, eats fortune cookies. And in fact, it is very much I guess you could call it a Chinese-American invention at the time, something like almost 100 years old. But what it represents is the mashing of cultures, the mashing of ideas that have essentially created acceptance and also created a way in which we, much like open source, composed ideas on top. Whether you call it fusion cuisine, whether you call it international cuisine, whether you call it confusing cuisine, it doesn't matter. The point is that we're meshing cultures together as a way to create deeper understanding, but also as a way to connect ourselves. Open source has done this with code, but we've done this with culture for such a long time already. There are 45,000 Chinese restaurants in America. That is more than there's McDonald's, KFC, Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, and all fast food chains combined in America. Think about that. And Chinese food is always rated amongst the most popular of food in America. Now, I love Chinese food, and I know we all know that Chinese food is perhaps one of the best, if not the best in the world. However, the point is this: we can interact with culture. We can create understanding through forms in which culture can mash up. And food was that early form of understanding. We can love Chinese food, even though we are not Chinese. And with open source, we can love the code that exists, even though we're not from that country. And with non-fungible tokens, we can learn to love other cultures without actually being from those cultures, because we can mash up these digital experiences in an open, composable way. Thank you.
Thank you, Yat. Thank you for sharing. 谢谢 Yat 给我们介绍了 NFT 为什么作为数字资产的这样的一种评价方式啊，它有它的一定的优越性。也给我们说到了，其实无论是跨国家、跨地域，还是跨这个资产之间，我们怎么去拥有资产，怎么去确定资产，怎么去评估资产 ，NFT 都给我们提供了比较好的一个可能性。